I should check it for next life.
All right, everyone. Congratulations on making it to the semis of the University of Chicago. Also known as the 7th grade. And now we have Brandeis on the government. So unless you have any questions for us, whenever you're ready, we are ready.
Here.
Thank you so very much for calling me up here, Mr. Speaker. Are we recording? Oh, we are recording. That's a little weird that I can see myself. Someone fix that? Anyways. So, Alex and I, as we've been saying every round, except for yours, Hatterline, because I forgot, this is a very bittersweet tournament for us. It's our last regular season tournament together, and that's super sad because I love debating with this guy. You're going to see Y and Emma, or MG. But it's super happy because we love the Chicago tournament so very much. It's glad to be here. You guys have done an awesome job. We're super honored and proud to be in the semis, hitting really true friends on to side off. So, Dave has done a lot for me in debate. He's really made me reflect on what I think debate is. That run at Rutgers was great. And I think I have a different conception of debate, though. So I think that debate ought to be things that you advocating for things you believe in thoroughly. So what Alex and I are going to do in this round, we're going to run the case in our casebook that we most thoroughly believe in. We think it will lead to a great round. So in the status quo, in order to get a public defender, one must pass an indigency test. In order to pass these indigency tests, there's a hearing in which your access in both liquid cash as well as things like home equity or 401ks are assessed. In order to be eligible for a public defender, you must be under an indigency level. And, well, I don't know exactly the specs to what the level is. So it's something like only about 20% of all Americans can do. Alex maybe will be able to tell me because he worked in a distant place.
Yeah, so it's like, thanks, Rich. So, it's around, like, 20, 30%. Yeah, I could literally say any number here, right? But yeah, it's around like 20 to 30%. Like, presumably the indigency test is not like, it doesn't let like 80% of people qualify, Like,
okay,
we're not going to make specific arguments as to like, yeah.
So, anyways, back to case study. So, what we're going to say is that these indigency tests should be removed, allowing anyone who wants a public defender to get one, if like in any sort of case where a public defender would otherwise be given by law. So, that's our case.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So the 20%, that's of the total population of the U.S.
Yeah. It's like that's a rough number, but it's around there.
It's like imperative to like the poverty line, or no? It'd be more.
It's above. So it is above the poverty line, but it's not by much. So like most college students would not be able to get a public defender with status quo because you have to pay college tuition, and that would be an expense that would like say you're above the indigency line.
If you need a lawyer, though, we can talk.
Okay, we're fine.
You're good? Yeah. Awesome. So we have 3 arguments. The first thing that Alex and I want to talk about is why we think a right to an attorney is a fundamental right for all. So we tell you that your right to an attorney stems from your fundamental right to a fair trial, which comes from the Bill of Rights. So we tell you is that in the 6th Amendment, it says that in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall have the assistance of counsel. And so what this means is that we don't think you should be able to be tried without an attorney. And this is the justification for why we have public defenders in the first place, because we recognize that poor individuals don't know how the justice system works. Don't understand exactly what's going on. And because of that, what we tell you is that necessarily you need to have an attorney. Otherwise, you can't adequately have your right to a fair trial because the legal system is so complicated. So, inasmuch as that's the case, we're going to tell you why money ought not be a factor in this. So, because the state has an obligation to provide you with an attorney, we think it's fundamentally unjust to deny you this right based on wealth for 3 reasons. First, we believe that this right should be universalized based on the social contract. So, the standard we use for rights is consent. It's a social contract. You give up some of your liberties, and in return, the government gives you other ones. So we think, though, that all individuals individually consent out from the state, out of the state of nature on an equal basis. We take on the same burdens, and thus have the same obligations on an equal level. Thus, when we all consent equally, we all get the same access to rights coming out. Because we put in the same, we all give up our right to kill, we all give up our right to steal, and because of that, we think we all should get the right to come out with. But second, in this specific case, the state is attacking you. Because the state, in this specific case, is literally finding someone to find you and put you in jail. We think because of that, they have a fundamental obligation to provide for your defense. This is why there's a higher burden for the state to provide for this right than any other. So I might argue in this round, the state doesn't have an obligation to provide things like public schools for rich people. We think it should, but that's a different story. But their burden in this round is to justify why. If the state stabs you, they shouldn't be obligated to at least provide an option to pay for your treatment. We think they certainly should, and we think this is a right. But third and most importantly, this financial cost is imposing a punishment on the innocent. So just because I happen to have the bad luck to be charged with a crime doesn't mean I should have to pay an exorbitant fee to defend myself. We think if I'm innocent, my right to property when I have to pay for a lawyer is fundamentally violated by the state. Alex and I will tell you that's a fundamentally unjust thing to do. and we don't think it's okay to do so. We think because of this, moreover, even if you don't buy those rights things, we think the state has an obligation to act. So we think that when the state derives a benefit from something, we think the state should foot the cost for it. So we tell you that we think the state derives a fundamental benefit from a just legal system. It gets guilty people put in prison, innocent people acquitted, etc., and that makes society better. So insofar as our system would definitely provide for more such outcomes, we think society ought pay for it. And we think when people are allowed a legal defense, it not only is good for dependents, but it's good for society. And we think because of that, the state should pay. The second thing we want to talk about is about the harms to means testing. So recognize, when you means test something, you're always going to have a group of people who can afford to be above the means test, but can't afford the lawyer. Essentially, this group on the margins is forcing to make a harmful choice. So for example, if I'm wealthy enough to have a lawyer, but poor enough so that hiring one means my family won't have health insurance, my kids won't be able to go to college, I'm coerced into making these bad decisions. When poor people like these have no other alternatives, they're forced to do one of three things. First, they could go pro se. We think that's bad because people have little to no expertise in the legal circuit, which means there's a worse trial and less of a likelihood of success. But moreover, we tell you there are meaningful rights harms based on the state making it so people cannot have meaningful representation when attacked by the state. Recognize, the state in this case is literally coercing you to go pro se because you don't have any other means to afford a lawyer. But also, when the state has more information than you, there are lots of harms. Like first, there's an incentive for individuals to take plea deals because they don't have adequate means to defend themselves. That's bad because it's meaningfully coercive. But also, there's meaningful harms in the trial due to a lack of knowledge and ability to defend yourself in the first place, which is the justification for why we have public defenders in the status quo. We think that's bad because it's more likely the defense will lose and there'll be unjust convictions. Second, they could plead guilty or take a plea bargain. But we think that's wrong, because it means that individuals have to choose between fighting this charge and providing for their families. We think this is bad, because it means more innocent people are in jail, and more crimes are not solved because innocent people will take these things because they don't have meaningful representation. But third, they could hire a lawyer at exorbitant costs. We tell you that if people can afford to hire a lawyer, there still are meaningful harms. We tell you that money is zero sum, and that money spent on this lawyer are things that can't be spent on other things like food or clothing, or even just things to enrich yourself like a college education or a vacation to Tahiti. We tell you that any of these things are important to individuals being able to self-actualize and being able to live their lives, and we don't think individuals should have to choose. But also, we tell you this is wrong because it victimizes two groups unfairly. First, it victimizes the accused because it's not his fault he was charged with the crime. Recognize, there are certainly cases where people are picked up unjustly, and the state is doing this, so it's wrong to victimize him here. But second, the accused family get hurt here because the financial harms of the situation. We think that's bad. So what we tell you is an analogous situation is if you were walking around the sidewalk and someone holds you hostage. We think side opposition has to justify a scenario where the government doesn't step in when they know you have enough money to pay for ransom. Recognize you've been hurt by something you can't control. We think because of that, the government has obligations to make sure you're safe, to make sure you're protected. We think that's incredibly important. You guys got a POI? Cool. The final thing we talk about is why we get a better system. First, I think we get less innocent people in jail. I think in a cost-benefit scenario, most people would probably take the plea bargain or guilty plea option in an effort to save their family from harm. This means there are more rights harms and more innocent people wasting away in the prison system and coming out disadvantaged. There's that because prisons are really bad in the status quo. You have things like revolving door effects. You have things like gangs. Lesser job opportunities for people who get out of prison. We tell you that's incredibly wrong and it's incredibly bad for these individuals. But second on this point, we tell you, the larger the scope of things, the more political will there is to reform it. We tell you that people see public defenders only as affecting the poor, and so don't vote to provide them lots of benefits. So you can compare this to things like Social Security, which affects everyone, and so there's political will to make sure Social Security is the third rail of American politics, and people will vote to fund it. We think this is good, because political will gets public defenders things like higher pay, better resources for cases, or just more public defenders to ease the already overburdened caseload. We think this is big, and we think it's incredibly important. Finally, though, we think we get a check on aggressive police officers or DAs. We tell you oftentimes the police will coerce false confessions from people by haranguing them and holding them over in court. We tell you in the status quo, people on the margin are incentivized not to fight these false charges because of this heavy cost. What we do is we even the playing field here. When the police go after somebody who maybe could afford a lawyer, but has to make this choice, oftentimes they do just capitulate because they can't do this in the status quo. We tell you that DAs are often willing to go for trumped up charges if the accused seems like being at a disadvantage to score political points. We think that's incredibly bad. But moreover, we think there is no greater disadvantage, no greater coerced choice than having to choose between providing for your own family or providing for your legal defense. Alex and I think that's an abhorrent system. We think that individuals like this have a right to be represented, and we think because of that, we ought to be able to give them this protections. And for that reason, we are so proud to propose.
All right, thanks, Prime Minister, for his remarks, and I'll call upon the Leader of the Opposition to give the next constructive speech of the round, lasting no longer than 8 minutes.
So thank you for calling me up here. Thanks especially to Seth for debating with me. I'm so proud of him for being in semifinals at the first tournament which he's ever broken. Guys Inside Government, a very interesting case. I actually liked it a lot. So that said, we have 2 points off case. The first thing we're going to talk about is how public defenders are a zero-sum game, that not everybody can ultimately have one, and that if that's the case, then what their side of the house ultimately does is deprive certain individuals of this right, but just by sort of giving lawyers to individuals who could have afforded one anyway. So basically we think it is just a fact that many people just can't get a public defender because there aren't enough of these individuals. It is not something that pays particularly well. It is something that people coming out of law school don't generally decide to do. At that point, now maybe they're going to collapse in sort of this public will argument. But we're going to show you how that's functionally marginal and it doesn't provide enough solvency for the system to massively increase the sort of need for these individuals, to massively increase the number of people who have access to them, and to thus take them away from those people who actually need them because they couldn't have made it on their own way using their own means. So we think their side can't just claim this magical solvency that all of a sudden there's going to be enough of these individuals. They have to provide the real causal link for how they're going to have enough people working in the field of public defense that everybody is going to be able to have one of these attorneys. If that is not the case, and it is to some extent a zero-sum game, to some extent an exercise of rationing, then we would say on our side of the house, we would want to default to those individuals who definitely cannot afford a lawyer. Now, they can talk about the marginal cases of individuals who are sort of on the borderline. Maybe those people actually are somewhat poor. Maybe those people would have a hard time defending a lawyer. This is a reason to raise the bar of what it means to be indigent. This is not a reason to allow every single individual to raise that bar to infinity. I don't think that's the rational decision that you should make here. So ultimately, the worst off are denied their right to a lawyer on side government, and nobody is denied a right on our side of the house because you may have a right to defense, but if you can purchase that defense, then you can still actualize on that right without the government having to provide it for you. So ultimately, we don't get rid of anybody's rights on our side of the house, but on their side of the house, they certainly do deny the rights of individuals who are forced now into a system where there aren't enough of these public defenders, where they aren't necessarily going to be as good, because if they're going to be fishing for more individuals to fill that need, then these people just aren't going to be very good lawyers. And I think that they're going to get stuck with a worse person than who they would have had on our side of the house. We think those are the people we should care about the most. Go.
Yeah, so public schools are also incredibly overburdened. Would you means test those too?
No, I would not means test public schools. I think that there's a big distinction here, though. Ultimately, I think that on our side of the house, we talk I guess the difference though is public schools are overburdened, but they're not overburdened to the same extent. Public schools are not as much of a zero-sum game. You can continue to send a lot of people to public schools, and yes, maybe it makes your education marginally worse, but it doesn't literally deny anybody else the ability to go to public school. We do still have every public school available for every individual. So at that point, maybe it's not quite as good, but on their side of the house, it's not only not as good and you get a worse lawyer, but also you just may not get one in the first place, and that is a big problem. So the second constructive argument we want to make is why it's actually a good idea sort of to paternalize a bit in this circumstance. And so we think basically the problem of offering a free lawyer to individuals who are comparatively wealthier and who could have purchased a better lawyer for their own defense, could have purchased a lawyer sort of who they would have paid, is that those individuals oftentimes will sort of see this banner of this being free, and that's something that looks attractive on face, right? It looks attractive to not have to pay your lawyer. If you think, for instance, that your case is like a clear one, something like that, you might be incentivized to just take the public defender, even if you have access and have the means to ultimately have the money to buy a better one for yourself, and to buy one that wouldn't have otherwise gone to a poor individual, right? So you create this harm for other people simply because you think you have a case that seems obvious to you, and ultimately at that point, I think you not only create that harm for other people, but potentially create a harm for yourself if the case isn't as clear as you actually thought. So people aren't these magical rational beings that always know the correct thing to do in every circumstance for their own defense and for the benefit of themselves. So I think if they're incentivized to choose this free lawyer because it looks good that it's free, they are harming other individuals, and they're potentially harming themselves if, for instance, they didn't know about some evidence that existed, something like that. I think that that's a bad thing on their side of the house when you have individuals making this wrong decision. We should just allow the people who can't afford these lawyers otherwise to get these public defenders, and we should not allow individuals to harm the system in this way, to take away lawyers from others, and to ultimately create a circumstance in which they maybe don't get the defense that they actually could have used otherwise. No thanks, Rich. Let's do case side. First thing they talk about is how there's a fundamental right to an attorney. Now, look, here's the deal. You can have an attorney if you can afford one, though. So that right is not being denied to you. So at that point, yes, you may have a right to have an attorney represent you in court, but insofar as you can have an attorney represent you in court, if you can afford to do so, then the right isn't being denied at all. So we functionally tell you that you do have this right, and you can have one because you can afford it. They tell us we all give up the same things, so we should all have the same rights. Now, yes, maybe to some extent this means that we should all have access to a lawyer in some kind of way, but it doesn't mean that we should tailor that right in the exact same way for every individual, but it makes more sense to allow individuals who can afford it, who to not have to burden the system, and to instead be the ones who ultimately will take these public defenders. So then they say there's a right to property, and if you have to pay for a lawyer, the government is violating your right to property by forcing forcing you to do this. This is crazy. This would literally make not providing anything a property rights invasion, right? Like, the government sets up circumstances oftentimes under which people live. If under those circumstances you have to buy certain things, like if you have to buy health insurance or something like that, it doesn't mean that the government is violating your right to privacy because you are harming other individuals potentially by not exercising it that way. Yeah.
Okay, but by forcing you to literally go to court, by haranguing 40 to 50 years in jail on you, don't you think that is meaningfully coercing you into giving up your property?
No, not in particular. Like, the point is, yes, like, the government is, like, forcing you to do all these things, first of all, because it suspects you of a crime, which, like, if you commit the crime, then you certainly did consent to the system. But, like, this isn't, like, the government just, like, looking out for, like, this guy, like, I want to send him to prison, I want to do terrible shit to him. Like, the government is attempting to figure out whether this person committed a crime. They're attempting to, like, create justice, and yes, you have to, like, go to court, and that sucks, but, like, it, like, is also the case that the government sets up many other circumstances in life in which you might have to do something, and might have to make a purchase, but it doesn't functionally mean then that the government is violating your right to property by having a system under which they don't give you everything. Like, I don't see why that's actually the case. The second thing that they talk about is the harms to means testing. They talk about the people on the margins. So yes, there will always be people on the margins. That is better than not having a system at all. There's the same kind of argument people give about giving people the ability to drive at a certain age, or giving people letting people drink alcohol at 21 and things like this. Yes, there are some harms on the margins, but the point is it is better to have a margin than to not have anything and just allow everybody to do this. So we're willing to concede some of these problems exist. Maybe there are reasons to consider a different margin, but it ultimately isn't the case that this is worth getting rid of the policy over. They're certainly throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we tell you, public defenders often have a lot of these harms anyway that they talk about. They're like, guys, you might take a plea bargain, whatever. But if you're getting a bad public defender on their side of the house because somebody else took the others, and is way too much need for public defenders for these individuals to actually be high quality lawyers, then a lot of these same harms they talk about in terms of the progress of your defense and whether or not you do a good job are things that you get on their side of the house as well at an increasing cost. And guess what? The people who are most likely to be victimized by this system are the very poorest people, and those are the people that they potentially disallow from getting a lawyer on their side of the house, and we make sure, at least on ours, that those people absolutely can get one. Then they say you're hurt by something out of your control, so therefore the government has an obligation to give you a lawyer. I don't understand what that causal link is. Why is the fact that something bad happened to you mean that you ought to have a lawyer? Something bad might happen, you might get cancer, but that doesn't mean the government has to provide you a lawyer. They're two different things, right? The fact that something external and bad has happened to you does not prove that you ought to get a lawyer. And unless, of course, you did the crime, that doesn't really prove their side. The last thing they talk about is a better system. They say there's going to be more public will, and therefore we're just going to solve all these harms. There's going to be this massive increase in funding. This is just an unrealistic argument. There's just simply not the case that this is going to be a sufficient improvement in order to just sort of fix the system and allow it to meet the amount of extra demand that they create on their side of the house. So at that point, it's maybe people will like the system a little bit more, but they won't like it so much more that they're all of a sudden willing to give up their own tax money to that, willing to give up their social programs for that. They just have to prove a much bigger causal link here. They would have to really show you how this is going to so massively increase the amount of funding that it would compensate for the harms that they cause, and they haven't done that yet. I hope Alex does a better job in the MG. We're very proud to oppose.
All right, thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks, and now call upon the member of the government to give the next constructive speech of the round, lasting no longer than 8 minutes.
Hear, hear.
Alright. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I want to actually start where Dave leaves off, the idea about political will. Because here's the thing. Realize they can't just get up here and assert, well, there won't be political will. We gave you actual arguments as to why there will be political will, but here are 4 more arguments as to why there will be political will. So realize, first of all, insofar as this system applies to all, we think that people will better be able to basically see that it's a more universal system. Like, for example, in the status quo with Medicare, which applies to basically everyone who's over the age of 65, as opposed to Medicaid, which applies only to the poor, there's much more political will for that. We think it's just definitionally true there being more political will for more funding. But second of all, we gave you the example of Social Security. We gave you examples of universal programs. Their burden is to get up here and tear these examples down with arguments, not just to play to your intuitions and try to call into question this argument. They didn't even beat the few warrants we gave there. And also realize, Mr. Speaker, the third thing is about the idea that people will identify with this system. Why? Because everyone knows that they could actually be in front of a court system. Everybody knows that they, but for the grace of God, could end up in this situation. And that's an incentive, august panel, to actually implement this system. That's important. And fourth of all, look, rights outweigh at the end of the day. Build one less fucking Tomahawk missile. I don't really care. Even if we lose this argument, if you think it's a more just system, in order to allow for this, you're gonna be picking us up. But you're going to be picking us up anyways. Well, let's go into the argument. The first thing they talk about is that public defenders are a zero-sum game. So, fun fact, there's this case called Gideon v. Wainwright, which guarantees you the right to a public defender. Like, if you don't get a public defender in the cases that are covered under it, you can literally call, you can call on SCOTUS, and Scalia will be like, alright, well, I'll actually help take care of this. Like, realize there is a right, so you're going to be able to have a public defender. But second of all, we think you do get more political will for the 4 arguments I already put into case, which they didn't respond to. But third of all, they need to warrant why everyone's going to suddenly choose the public defender now, right? It's like, oh yeah, you implement the system, everybody's going to choose it, because the public defender is such a great reputation. Like, no, we think people can make rational calculi as to say, I can get a better private attorney and it is worth more to me for my defense. What we think people should, though, have the choice for is to decide, well, maybe I'll take, perhaps what could be a marginally worse outcome, perhaps, in order to give my kids a college education, in order to give my kids, health insurance or something like that. We think you should allot people a choice for that, and we don't think that there will necessarily be this huge flood of people that they talk about that are going to clog up the system. So insofar as that is true, actually, guess what? Even if political will, we don't get a lot more money, we get enough to cover the people who will be covered under this. We solve the margins. Also realize, so the other response is Gideon v. Wainwright, that's already there. But also realize, we think that rights outweigh in this example, right? Like, listen, if at the end of the day we have to build less Tomahawk missiles, if at the end of the day we have to build one less bridge to nowhere, we're fine with that. If we can prove that there's a justice claim, and I think we did with our first point on case, which I'm going to talk about, then they ought provide it. Because guess what? That's an argument against the justice system overall, right? That's an argument against public defenders. It costs money. But guess what, Madam Speaker? Realize if that's a more just justice system, then we are proud to defend that on our side of the house. And then they say, raise the bar. So first of all, this is contradictory analysis, right? They're like, raise the bar so it magically solves all the problems. No, guys, that's essentially what we're doing on our side of the house. You have to defend the status quo. Sorry about that. Second of all, though, realize it agrees with our rights analysis. It agrees there is a harm in the status quo. It agrees there are people on the margins who are being harmed. These are all things that they didn't talk about, which are really going to impact the shit out of on case. But third of all, realize that there's actually an economic argument here. Realize insofar as there's a market for public defenders, right? You got to figure that private attorneys, if you raise the bar, are not going to charge for what a public defender would cover, because ostensibly they're going to say, well, no one will take us because they could take the public defender instead. So there will still be people on the margins on their side of the house, regardless of whether they raise it to. That's really important because it kills their entire point. Then the second thing they talk about, it's a good idea to paternalize. And these individuals are they should basically, the public defender system is going to look really attractive. It's going to coerce people into coming here. So, few responses. First of all, we think the choice is theirs to make. The state shouldn't meaningfully coerce you into a system in which you have to choose between taking care of your children and providing for legal defense. We think that in general, in terms of coercion, we're certainly going to win this argument. But second of all, once again, they also do coerce choice on their side of the house. Third of all, we think that people are rational, right? If they think they can get a better defense, they're probably going to go for a private lawyer. The only thing is they're going to be able to weigh, as rational individuals, the legal costs of, should I get a public defender who may be marginally worse? I'll talk about public defenders in a second. Weighing that between, the futures of their children. I think that's something they can weigh, and I think that's something they should have the choice to do so. But also realize public defenders are not, all that bad. They're trained, and if they actually screw up procedurally, you can file an appeal and actually claim it as a constitutional violation. I don't know where this happened. It happened in, Tennessee recently, but you can do that, and that's something we'd be fine defending on our side of the house. But, in general, let's go on case, because there were a couple of key drops here which damn their entire analysis. The first thing we talked about is there's a right for an attorney to all. And they didn't opt 6th Amendment. What a surprise. But they say, you can have an attorney if you pay for it. But here's the thing. We're arguing that you should facilitate this right because of the 3 warrants we provided. But also realize we think that there probably should be a facilitative right if there's a meaningfully high bar to access. So that's something they can chew on as well. We talked about why money ought not be a factor. We provided 3 separate standards, which they only sort of glibly responded to. The first one is about the idea of rights in the social contract. How all individuals consent equally, and therefore they should have the same access to rights. And all we hear is well, we don't tailor all rights for all people. But look, this is a very, intuitive argument, right? If you put in the same stake, you ought to get the same rights out of it, Mr. Speaker. He can provide this glib response, and this is probably not where PMR will necessarily go, but at the same time, he hasn't beaten this social contract argument, this basic idea of equal input, equal stake, equal output. Realize if they don't beat that, they're going to lose the round. But second thing they drop here is that the state is attacking you, right? Even if you don't believe everyone should have a right to education, the state is literally come with me, and arresting you, taking away
away your freedom, taking away your autonomy. We think the state has an obligation, or actually I'll take you at the end of this point, to help facilitate your defense in this case. They don't touch this point at all. What?
Yeah, but isn't the benefit to this whole social contract analysis that you have a criminal justice system in the first place?
Oh yeah, actually that's our third subpoint. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But also the final thing we talked about is that it's imposing costs on the innocent, that rights are violated in this case, and they just say, well, you're not providing anything, like, we make you buy health insurance and things like that. But there's a difference between facilitating the public interest and actually harming someone and then putting them in a situation where they have to pay. Like, I can say everyone has to go to public schools, even if that might cost some money, but when you take these people, take away their autonomy, and put them in a situation where they are literally basically being held hostage, that's the distinction. But also, about this idea of an obligation to act and about a public benefit, you're right, it is in the public interest to have a just justice system. This was our third subpoint, which they completely misaddressed. Realize, Madam Speaker, August Panel, whatever it is, realize that insofar as you're deriving a benefit here, we think that you ought to facilitate a more just justice system. And why do we get a more just justice system? You have less people going pro se, less people taking plea bargains, less people making a meaningfully coerced choice to go for a worser outcome. If they don't respond to that, they're going to lose the round. We also talked about the harms of means testing, about the groups on the margin. They just say, margins are better than not having a system at all. Cross-apply my 4 responses from off case, but also realize we have a system, we will have public defenders. The only possible impact they could get on this point is we might have somewhat worse public defenders, but Madam Speaker, that outweighs having no public defender in the first place. That outweighs forcing like thousands of people to go pro se. That's really important. We talked about the alternatives that you were forced to, and they just say, well, a bad public defender is pretty bad, but realize, first of all, they're decent. If not, you can file a violation. Second of all, you can consent to this, like you can actually weigh these options. And third of all, it's better than none at all. And fourth of all, we think that the only ones who will choose this will be the people who are actually in dire need. That's important. They say it's going to be worse for the poor, but like, look, we're talking about the rest of society too. Like on our side of the house, we solve for all harms. Then we talk about how it victimizes the two groups unfairly. They say the government's not responsible. It's like you get cancer. Yeah, but if the government fucking poisons you, like we think they have an obligation. The government is the one causing the harm. That's the distinction, guys. Finally, we get a better system. We get less innocents in jail. This is a more just justice system on our side of the house. It's the biggest impact in the round, and they dropped it. We talk about how there's a larger scope means more will to perform it. I've already talked about it. And we check aggressive police. Madam Speaker, August Panel, whoever you are. Proud of you.
Thank you, members of the government, for those remarks, and now call upon Madam Speaker Clara to call upon the next speaker.
I thank the previous speaker for establishing me as the speaker of the round, and call upon the member of opposition to close out the constructive portion of this round. Here, here.
So I'd just like to thank everybody on the panel. Dave, it's been a fantastic tournament. I'm so happy to be here. You guys, seriously, you're great people. Glad to be hitting you. Glad to be talking about the criminal justice system. So a weird thing happens in debate. I've been listening to their speeches and just like using this lofty language about how they're going to fix everything and society's going to be so much better. I'm just like, wow, is this case tight? Like, what's happening here? I want to help everybody, right? And so, like, I think Dave solves this, and I think that Alex is right to talk about political will. Because this system doesn't work if the money isn't put into it in the first place to make sure it's going to work. And they have to deal with this double bind. So either wealthy people are using the system and they take lawyers away from poorer people, or as they say, they're not going to use the system. And then you're not going to have all of this political will that they're talking about in the first place. They simply can't get around this. They don't ever demonstrate how you're going to have this great political will for a program that will always be associated with poor people. It's not like people who are super wealthy are now going to get public defenders and then they're going to change the stigma associated with it. They needed to actually give you some sort of causal link as to why the society is going to look at this differently, no thank you, and actually want to fund it more. Because the fact of this case is, if we don't put more money into it, if we don't get better lawyers, and if we don't get more lawyers, then the people who actually need lawyers the most will not be able to get them. Yes, we're defending a status quo that is flawed, but a worse society is one where the poorest people who need lawyers the most, who are most likely to be victimized by the state and are most likely to be accused of things that they didn't do, cannot get public defenders in the first place. I don't think that they ever get around that. They just assert this effect that we haven't seen in anything that doesn't really make any sense. So our first point is that the public defenders are a zero-sum game. There's only so much money. All of these things we've been talking about. Alex just gives this argument that it's not an argument. That's Gideon v. Wainwright. I was waiting for like a few sentences after that, explaining as to why this like somehow supports their case. We never really got it. Yes, you have a right to an attorney. Yes, we actually have that right because people can afford the attorney. no, you don't have the right to an attorney anymore if the public defender system is so overburdened that you can't have proper support. Just saying that like we're the ones violating rights neglects the fact that if the public defenders are terrible, you're not actually getting this right to an attorney guaranteed you in Gideon versus Wainwright in the first place. There's a right violation on both sides. Theirs is more severe. I think it's a big problem. They say that like, we always also say you can't assume this great growth. All of these things we were talking about. Yeah, sure.
Okay, but literally what the argument Alex said was that given that Gideon exists, you are guaranteed an attorney. So how can your argument that people just won't get lawyers ever make sense?
What?
So given you're guaranteed an attorney under the Constitution, why does your argument make sense that people won't get lawyers anymore?
Because the system will be overburdened, there won't be enough lawyers, and some people will be left in a system that coerces them into taking plea bargains in the first place because they're so tremendously overworked, also used like doing work for richer people, that the system will be worse for them. There is a rights violation on their side of the house. Don't let them lie to you and say that it's only on ours or that we have one at all. If you don't have proper legal support, then there is a rights violation. You're not getting your Sixth Amendment right. Don't let them just say Gideon versus Wainwright over and over again and expect that to be an argument. The second thing we say is that sometimes you need to paternalize. They just say like the state shouldn't coerce you, and like our response is obviously why if you're going to make the wrong decision, and if that wrong decision is then going to harm other people as well. We paternalize all of the time when we think that it's going to improve the system, and they never give you any of like the really stock arguments as to why paternalism is bad. They just say the state shouldn't coerce you. Yes, the state should coerce you if it actually leads to a better result. And insofar as someone taking a public defender because they think it's going to be cheaper, because they think they have a clear-cut case, also hurts them, but also hurts all of the other people who need lawyers. And they say that people are rational. People will always make the right decision. All you have to do is look at how much debt I have on my credit cards right now to know that people aren't just rational all the time about money. It's really ridiculous to say that people just make the right decision when it comes to money. Yeah, they'll be fine, they'll make the right decision. No, almost never do people make the most rational choice about money. I think that they're not going to make the right decision here a lot of the time, and that just overburdens the system even more. It's a really, really bad situation. Going case side. First thing they talk about is how you have a fundamental right to a lawyer. We say that this right isn't being denied. The reason why you have this test is to find people who actually can afford the lawyer so that the entire system works, right? They say that it should be facilitative. Sure, it would be really nice if we had all of this extra money to do this. And it's really nice that like Alex and Rich are okay with taking money out of the military for all of these like bridge to nowhere things. And that'd be really nice if the political system actually worked in a way where we took money from the places that aren't using it properly. But we know that that's not actually how the system works. I think most likely if you get all of this extra money, it's going to come from places like entitlements that are politically unpopular and not from places like the military. So insofar as, yeah, we think it should be facilitative, but we can't actually do that in a way that doesn't violate rights. You should do it in the way that works best for the people who need it the most. They also say how like money not ought to be a factor. You consent into the social contract, and this is just a huge like terrible coercive thing happening. I don't buy this argument whatsoever. I think that so the idea of the stupid social contract example, I think social contract examples are ludicrous on face, but I'll do this anyway. Is that so everybody consents equally to the system, like they should be treated equally. All right, fine. Yes, everybody gets a lawyer. That's what we've been talking about the entire time. Yes, everybody gets the benefit of having a criminal justice system, and it's preferable to buy into a system that has a criminal justice system that does right most of the time than it is perfect. And insofar as we can't actually fix the system, the social contract analysis is upheld. We're doing okay because the criminal justice system is doing the things it needs to. It's making sure that people are getting this representation. That's why we have the test. And yes, is going to be a margin all of the time, but it's going to be suck for those people. But it's better that someone who makes like $50,000 has a little bit harder time with a lawyer making that money decision than someone who has no money having a public defender who pushes them into a plea bargain because they're overworked and they need to get to the next client. Here. Second thing they talk about is the harms to the means test. They say people may represent themselves, the state is coercing you, they're going to be coerced into plea bargains. Just once again, I think this is really, really important. Look to the argument that more people are going to be pushed into plea bargains, more people are going to be pushed into these shitty situations if the state is so overworked that they have to go from case to case to case, to client to client to client. It's going to happen over and over again. And insofar as people may represent themselves, yes, there's a very small amount of the population that may make that bad decision. But insofar as we try to come up with the best test we can to make sure that everybody can get a lawyer, we are doing a better job there. They also say that like money is a zero-sum game. That you shouldn't have to choose between like council and other things. Listen, it's just simply a shitty thing about society that we don't live in a utopia where all of like there's no money and everything is guaranteed to you all of the time. But insofar as we set some sort of bar that like gives the best thing we can to like make sure that everybody can have a lawyer, we're doing a better job. They say that it hurts the family, maybe, but people need to make value judgments all of the time. This is one of them. It's better to have it in place than to have a system that doesn't work for the people who really need it. Last argument, they get a better system. You have fewer people in jail. You don't have this revolving door thing as much. I just don't think so, because look, here's the reality of this round. There are two situations. One, where people who are in this margin, like people who make $40,000 or $50,000, whatever this line is, who have a harder time representing themselves. Or you have people who are the poorest in society who have to depend on the public defender system having bad representation. On which side of the house do you think you get a more just action? Which person do you think is more vulnerable and we should do more to protect? Because yes, it sucks that people in the margin aren't going to be able to get this all of the time. But their side of the house ensures that the people who need it the most can't possibly get it. And yes, Dave tells you that maybe we should move the line. They say like you have to defend the status quo, that's your job. But on our side of the house, we have the option of actually changing it and improving it based on how things are working. They're getting rid of it, they're flushing the system with stuff that it can't handle, and you're denying people the right to attorney and effective counsel. For all these reasons, we're really proud to oppose.
Alright, thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks. Now recall upon the leader of opposition to deliver the first rebuttal speech of the round, not to exceed 4 minutes, reminding him that while new examples are perfectly welcome, new arguments are not.
So, thanks so much. Alex comes up in the MG and he is very confident, but he is also very confidently wrong. Because I think ultimately all those things that he yells about are beaten by arguments both from the LOC and then certainly in the MO as well. So, one thing that I think is going to happen in the PMRs, Rich is going to come up here and he's going to be like, guys, listen, because he's learned from the Keith Barry School. He's going to be like, guys, rights are the most important. This is the trump card. We have to care about rights in this round. That is all well and nice if they actually win the rights point, but they haven't done so yet. The point is, you have a right to have an attorney. That means there's a person sitting next to you in court arguing your case for you. If you have the money to afford such an attorney, you have that right. You may choose not to exercise it. Maybe you make that decision because you like having money around or whatever. Like, I don't care why you make the decision. You have the right. You just chose not to exercise it. So, look. I'll go into the actual point. So the first thing I want to ask is, how do we make sure every person can actually have a lawyer in court? Because this is obviously the most important question if you care about rights like this. So look, the status quo public defender system does not currently have enough money to give a public defender to all the people that will take one on-site government if they implement their policy. That is clear, because the system is already overburdened, and if you introduce a number of people at the margins who are taking free lawyers, the system does not have enough money to handle that. But also, there's just not enough lawyers. Like, we made this argument as well. So, like, even if you believe that the system has a lot of money, if there aren't people who are public defenders, that doesn't mean that you can, like, automatically solve because these individuals aren't working there. So when you have people who can afford representation...
With respect, Madam Speaker, I think the argument that there aren't enough lawyers in the status quo to literally fit the demand is new.
Okay, it was in the LSC.
The panel individually will take it under consideration in each of their flows.
Okay. Cool. So we told you when you have people who can afford representation, taking the free lawyers, taking those lawyers that potentially could be helping individuals who could not afford one, the poorest people, those are the people that really need representation. Those are the people that are the most victimized, and those are the people who should be benefiting from a zero-sum system rather than the one that they get on their side of the house. So look, those people need lawyers and they don't get one on their side. They say, guys, no. The Supreme Court says you have to get a lawyer, so therefore, that's going to mean that everyone's going to get a lawyer. The Supreme Court saying that you have to get a lawyer does not create magic money, and it does not create magic lawyers. Like, yes, there will be a contradiction between what the Supreme Court says and what reality is. That's unfortunate, but like, ultimately, that doesn't mean that they actually can fill this burden on their side of the house. They have never given you the causal reason to believe that they're actually going to be able to fix the system, that they're going to create the funding that's necessary to do so. If anything, like if they manage to fix the system at all, if they manage to introduce lawyers in it, there will be awful, overworked, underqualified lawyers who won't be able to provide any semblance of a reasonable defense for any of these people. At least on our side of the house, we have comparatively better lawyers for those individuals who need them the most, for those people who are the poorest. So ultimately, either comparatively wealthier people take away lawyers from the poor, or there is no change in funding, because the only way that they've given access to any argument about increased funding is like, guys, this is going to be everybody's system now. But if it's everybody's system and everybody's using it, then you've already had this point where they take away the lawyers from the poor people. They had to show, they are the government team here, they had an affirmative burden to show why there's going to be sufficient funding to deal with the new amount of burden that's created on the system. Look, they can come up here and just call this an assertion or whatever. Yes, it is a challenge to their side to come up here and prove that argument. If they haven't done it, they have to drop the round, because just saying there will be an increase in political will doesn't mean there will be enough increase in political will. Second argument, how do we actually get good representation? So I've already shown how it's the case that you're going to get worse lawyers on their side of the house if all you do is just sort of like make more people public defenders and increase the system's amount of money a little bit, but not enough. So it is really harmful if somebody takes a bad public defender for a case that they think is clear, but ultimately they get screwed over on. So if I think that my case is pretty obvious, I might be inclined to take that free lawyer. I have an incentive to do so. I won't have to pay money, obviously. But that might be a bad decision for me. And Alex is like, guys, people don't make bad decisions. Like, this is crazy. People make really bad decisions. Maybe in debate rounds and economics textbooks, people are rational, but real human beings are not, and they make stupid decisions. And on our side of the house, we think it is better if, like, that decision to have a public defender only happens if you actually need one and not if you had an alternative scenario. Because look, it is bad for those people, they get bad representation, but it is especially bad when you take one because you would like to have one for free because you think your case is clear, but ultimately it robs the most victimized people in society of their ability to get representation. That rights claim is much more important than your rights claim to use your money in the way that you want to, as opposed to having to buy a goddamn lawyer because you are, after all, accused of a crime. So lastly, they talk about plea bargains. They're like, it's really bad because people are going to take plea bargains. This is worse with overburdened public defenders than even if you're representing yourself, but I think it's actually, like we told you, because they're overburdened, they have an incentive to sort of, not spend a lot of time on you. You will spend a lot of time on you, but even if that's not true, you'll probably have a lawyer that I don't think they've ever shown why everybody's going to just start representing themselves. For all of these reasons, they're very powerful.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks. Now recall upon the Prime Minister to close out the side for the government and this round as a whole, reminding him that new arguments are not okay, new examples are, and please don't reference Keith Barry in your speech. Here.
Turns out Alex and I are really bad at telling who the chair is. We've screwed up in both rounds. Anyhow, Dave's absolutely right. We're going to go with rights hardcore. Here's why. Recognize that societies themselves are based on recognizing the fundamental rights of the individual and protecting them over pragmatic circumstances. This is why we allow for things like double jeopardy, which literally let murderers walk free on the street, allowing massive pragmatic harm to society because we think individuals have a right against being tried twice. What does this mean? It means that if Alex and I can prove that there's a right to this, we automatically win this round, because all they've given are societal interests. Maybe there's an interest in giving people better defense, but there's a right to a lawyer. And you know what? Maybe you have a right to a lawyer. You don't have a right to the best damn lawyer. The same way you have a right to go to school, you don't have a right to go to Stuyvesant. We tell you that if we can show this is a facilitative right, you have to pick us up. So Alex gave one really killer reason why it is. It's the standard we use in this round that Seth dropped in MO. So to circle this, we told you that if you have a high bar to access, that it would cost you lots of money, the government ought to facilitate this. Why is this the case? Because what we tell you is that while it's great to say, yeah, you could have a lawyer, when you're forced to make choices, like sending your kids to college, or being able to feed your family, or other things like that, that is meaningfully a high bar to access, and we do think that's a necessary thing. Why is this a big problem for them? Because inasmuch as they drop this argument, even if you hate it, even if it's silly, you have to vote for it because it's on the flow and they never responded to it. But also, we gave you 3 more right standards coming out of PMC. We told you rights had to be given on an equal basis. And all we get to this is we don't tailor the social contract to everything. So what we told you is that inasmuch as you consent into this, we think you ought to get out of it. But especially for the second right standard, which is the state is actively causing you the harm. That inasmuch as someone actively causes you the harm, they have an obligation to rectify it. So yeah, maybe it would be different if someone else was suing you. That's why we're not public defenders in civil suits. But inasmuch as the state is the one trying to hurt you, the state is the one trying to send you to jail, and they have obligations due to the social contract to do the exact opposite. This is an obligation to make sure you have a lawyer. But third, we told you about the property rights thing. All they said is we require rights in other cases, like sometimes you have to go to school and stuff. Here's the thing. Well, there's a distinction between maybe interest that this state would do this for. This is a right. The state is necessarily hurting you, and in fact, they concede it's a right in their speeches. So inasmuch as that's the case, we tell you are facilitated. What do we get to this? But if there's too many people here, they say if there's too many people here, this will hurt it, and they'll never be able to have this stuff. This is silly. recognize that inasmuch as we're guaranteed to have lawyers, as Alex tells you, there's constitutional requirements, and the state can mandate people give individual lawyers based on this in the first place. So inasmuch as this is the case, we tell you we're always going to make sure people get lawyers. But also, even if the impact is that PDs are marginally worse on our side of the house, we think that's still better because they're individuals who do have rights being upheld, and we think because of that, we're always going to be winning this round. But even if you don't believe that, they harp on like our alternatives and political will and stuff. So we get this weird double bind that's like, there's either too much of this that's going to happen, or there's going to be none of it, either it's bad. I like the middle. I think that necessarily there are a situation where, you know what, Alex tells you the demand for this will be marginal. Want to know why? Because of a really rational incentive I brought up on a POI. I asked, if I'm thinking about going to jail for 30 to 40 years of my life, am I really going to want to go with the worst lawyer? Probably not. We think that individuals in this case are necessarily rational and will do this. Why is this important? Because it means the demand is minimal, so you don't need lots of extra money, because that means it solves all their problems. All we get from this is like an MO, but it might come from welfare. They might change it. So we would say that if you have to weigh these things, it's probably better to give people lawyers, given the massive criminogenic problems with prison and all the other problems with the system. We tell you that these are enough for us to win the round too. So remember, we showed it to right. If it's a right, you have to vote for us because we maximize rights. But the second question I want to ask is, even if not, who's got a better legal system? Because we also told you in our first independent point that if we win pragmatics and say there's an obligation to do this, because inasmuch as society derives benefit from this, we're able to do this. All we get from them is, but it's unrealistic to think that political will go up. Alex gave 4 responses to it that Seth missed. I'm going to give you highlights, but circle them and blow them all across. What we told you is that inasmuch as this will apply to all, and then you get more will, recognize that Seth tells you this is already seen in the status quo as the bastion of the poor. Things that people will always get and things that people won't get. You know what that means? When we change that and everyone can get it, it's not the bastion of the poor anymore. That's why there's more political will for Medicaid than there is for Medicare. That's why there's more political will for Social Security than there is for welfare. We tell you because of this, when it applies to more people, that's good. But even if it's just on the margins, remember, they never showed you that everyone would take a public defender, that everyone would want these cases. Inasmuch as this is true, we also tell you that we're far better on this sort of the system as well. We got this weird argument from them, though, that's like, people will just get a PD in cases that are obvious. So, first of all, we think the choice is still yours. And we think maybe there is a legitimate choice to take the PD in an obvious case so you can feed your family or go to college so you can get an education and better yourself. We think that's enough to say this. But even if not, we don't think people will do this because we don't think they would run the risk of going to jail and ruining their lives when these things are on the line. They never told you why in some cases people might be irrational, but in this case, I'm pretty sure literally no one would. And even if they are, we'll bite the harms. So where are we really winning this round? We told you about how innocents in the system get screwed, how people in the margin get hurt. What we told you is that people are coerced into plea deals. And while they say this may happen on our side, it happens a lot worse on theirs when no one is there to represent you, when you don't know the system, and prosecutors can strong arm you to put you in a far worse position. Madam Speaker, members of this panel, we told you that this is a right. We told you need to be able to be represented and need to be able to be protected. While they might harp on pragmatic things, they lose those too, but it doesn't matter because rights in this case trump. They never dealt with our right standards. They never showed you why it shouldn't be facilitated, and that's why they lose this round. Some things cost a lot. We think that this should.
All right, I thank the speaker.